Hey, welcome to Lab the Podcast. So grateful to be here with Patton Dodd. Patton is the Executive Director of Storytelling and Communications at the H.E. Butt Foundation in Texas. He also leads Know Your Neighbor, the foundation's initiative that creates media and events to build bridges across economic divides in San Antonio. Patton has over 20 years of experience in media, publishing, and communications. He's served as the editor for multiple national publications, and his writings appeared in Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Newsweek, The Atlantic, CNN, Christianity Today, and we could go on and on. He's taught courses in composition and literature and film studies at the United States Air Force Academy, holds a doctorate in religion and literature from Boston University, and is the author of multiple books, the recent one, The Father You Get, and The Ones You Make, Believe in, and Become. Patton lives in San Antonio with his family, and we have a mutual friendship. Our member of our board, Roger Sandberg, is the connection that connected us to Patton, so we're so grateful for that. Patton, thanks for sharing some time with us.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Zach.
Yeah, the last time we were with each other, I believe, was on the Oregon coast. Out at one of my
Correct.
favorite places, the coastline of the Pacific Ocean is one of the most beautiful and like haunting and disruptively gorgeous places. You're in San Antonio now, and how long has that been home for you?
We are coming up on 9 years that San Antonio, Texas has been home, which is a shocking truth for me and everyone in my family.
Yeah, the 9 year part specifically, like the
No, the
rootedness, or
San
the San
Antonio,
Antonio
Texas
part?
part. Yeah, I mean, if you had told me 15 years ago that I would have made Texas home, well, actually, if you would have told me it's been 9 years, if you would have told me 10 years ago that I would have made Texas home, I would have thought you were crazy. I thought Texas was just, Ted Cruz and tumbleweeds was all that I knew about Texas. I had not spent much time here except for Austin for South by Southwest over the years for work. But otherwise, yeah, Texas, I often say, was the 49th state that we ever wanted to move to. But we have been here 9 years and don't plan to leave. We have fallen for South Texas in particular is underrated. San Antonio is underrated. And we adore this place now.
Yeah. That's so strange how a place can become home like that. Cammy and I have been here in Tampa for 8 years. And same exact thing. If you would have told me Tampa, Florida would be home to me, I would have never imagined it and felt very comfortable in Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest. Loved the wild beauty of all that. Just
Mhm.
recently traveled to Oxford, and I told my wife, like, okay, if there was a place I felt like I was meant to live, it would probably be Oxford, not Tampa, Florida. But this is home, and it's beautiful, and we're starting to see really cool things. What do you love about San Antonio that has made it feel like home?
The breakfast tacos are unparalleled, better than the ones in Austin. That's a debate that happens, and I'm surprised the debate is still raging because the answer is pretty clear to me. You can throw a rock and hit an amazing taqueria where you can get amazing tacos made by someone who has just freshly made those tortillas in the back kitchen, for $1, $2. And so there's the culinary traditions that are inherent to this place from indigenous culture, from Mexico, Central America, that make their way here, as well as Texas food. The convergence of all those is just wonderful. So it's a great food place. It's it's really beautiful. The live oak trees are maybe the dominant kind of geographic feature, and they're not evergreen, but they're green all the time. They lose and regain their leaves, kind of at the same time, and so they're beautiful. They're gnarly and haunting, and gorgeous. Our backyard is dominated by a massive old Texas live oak tree, and then the people. I mean, it's a purple city, kind of politically. And I like that. It's not too homogenous ideologically. It's a majority minority city. As a white person, I'm in the minority here, ethnically. It's growing more diverse all the time with, the influx of immigrants really from all over the world, including the Middle East. And so I don't know, it's just a fascinating, I think Texas is like I said, I always thought of it through the lens of, well, the media or whatever. And Texas has earned its bad reputation politically, and continues to earn it. But once you're here and settled and meet people, the hospitality, again, the food, the beauty, the deep traditions that this place has. Yeah, it's kind of a wonderful place to live. Also, the weather, the climate is kind of, I think, also better than you might expect. At least October through April, maybe early May, it's really pleasant. Um, and then the summer is like our winter, in if you lived in the Northeast, and so you kind of go indoors for a few months. But much of the year, it's really a great place to be climate wise as well.
Yeah. Well, this is a San Antonio story, so that's helpful, right? To get a picture of
Yeah,
the city. And because when Roger, really the catalyst for this conversation was our mutual friend, Roger Sandberg. And as we were
yeah,
talking earlier, this project, this podcast, we're thinking about we would say, the life and beauty of the gospel. How does the Christian faith in
yeah,
particular lead to an embodied experience that is just and towards human flourishing, not just for some, but for a universal idea that there is a picture of good that is a universal good, and that we get to participate in that. And that those ideas aren't just in abstraction, they're not just theory. But really, kind of the revolutionary thing about the Christian faith is that it's a call to like incarnate, to participate in things that pull us outside of ourselves and cause us to know our neighbor, to love our neighbor. And I'm always interested not just in the ideas, but where can we see that being embodied? And so I was talking to Roger about this, and he said, when you think about this in terms of a city or a community, there is a great example of this happening in San Antonio. And he just kind of pointed me in the direction of your work. And a long time ago, I encountered a book from Jane Jacobs. I don't know, The Death and Life of Great American Cities.
yeah, yeah.
I remember,
Masterpiece.
yeah, I read it, and I had no view. That's not my lane. And so as I was reading, I was like, this is this beautiful picture of a city as an ecosystem, and how does it function with people and sidewalks and front porches and parks. And it was so fascinating to me,
Yeah.
and the complexity of what makes a city work in a way that's beautiful and good and true, not just for some, but for all. So that's what we're going to get into. This is the project that you've been working on, Know Your Neighbor, touches this. But before we get into it, talk about H.E. Butt Foundation and the
Okay.
organization level. Your title is Storytelling and Communications Executive Director, which I think is the coolest job ever. Is it as cool as it sounds? And what's the work of the foundation? And then maybe take us to the initiative and when that kicked off, and give us a view on that before we start to get into San Antonio.
Sure. So the HEBI Foundation is unique in that it is an operating foundation. Mostly when you think of a foundation, you think of grant making. We don't do much of that. We're an operating foundation. I think something like 5% of foundations are considered operating foundations, which what that means is that we create our own programs and operate, staff them, and run them. It's kind of like a collection of a lot of little nonprofits. Each of our programs has its own brand identity, its own constituency, and so the foundation was founded in 1933, and so has a deep history. But what most people know about the H.E. Butt Foundation in Texas is, for a long time, the core of our work has been running camps and retreats in the hill country of Texas. If you're not from Texas, you don't know the hill country, but if you're from Texas, you know the hill country really well. It's a tens of thousands of acres of rolling hills, and scrub oak and live oak trees and canyons and rivers, and it stretches across from central to west Texas for a long time. And it's there that the Butt family, HEB is the name of the grocery store chain in Texas that most Texans shop at, and that family purchased a 2,000-acre property just outside of Leakey, Texas, about 2 hours north of San Antonio. with the goal of having a space that would be, stewarded really well environmentally, and that would make outdoor experiences possible for kids from what we might call the inner city, kids from, low income backgrounds. That was kind of their original vision. Let's have a place where kids can come in 100 years and see the stars and experience nature for free. And so that's one thing the foundation has done for a long time, is make that property available free of charge to organizations and churches that serve people from historically marginalized communities. And so that's called H.E. Butt Foundation Camps. It's one of 5 camping and retreat programs that we run out of that canyon. The other 4 are an outdoor school program for Texas public schools, mostly schools in Title I schools in San Antonio, an adult retreat center, Christian retreat center, ecumenical, called Laity Lodge, which in some circles is kind of this legendary place. It's really beautiful, and has been home to a lot of Christian leaders over the years. But really, it was founded by Howard Butt Jr. To be a place for the laity, which is a old-fashioned, outdated word these days, but of course just means the people of faith, the people of God, right? Not ministers necessarily, except for the theory, of course, and the truth is that we're all ministers in our daily lives. So that is kind of the ethic and the virtue, or vision behind Laity Lodge. Out of that came Laity Lodge Youth Camp, summer 2-week summer youth camp, that runs throughout every summer, and then Laity Lodge Family Camp, that runs weekend retreats throughout the year for families, and then week-long retreats during the summer. So that's the camping and retreat programs. About 25,000 people a year experience those programs. So
Wow.
it's a significant lift, and it's, like I said, what the foundation has long been known for in Texas. In about 8 years ago, however, the Howard Butt Jr., who was the longtime president, passed away, and his son-in-law, David Rogers, who had been working here for a long time and helping to run the camps and then everything else, took the reins of the organization with his wife, Deborah Rogers, Howard's daughter. And they were kind of tasked with expanding the mission of the organization. And a long story, but to sum it up, where we have arrived at in recent years is another program that's outside the canyon called Community Engagement. And it is itself a collection of initiatives that are based mostly in San Antonio. And we're doing mental health work. We're launching a new nonprofit right now called the Congregational Collective that works with religious communities, houses of faith in San Antonio, to make them to resource them for the mental health challenges that are happening in their midst. There's a capacity building initiative that works with local nonprofits and helping those leaders run their organizations in more efficient and effective ways. And then a storytelling wing, which kind of gets us to what I spend about half my time on, a storytelling initiative that we call Know Your Neighbor, which seeks to use stories to bridge San Antonio's economic gaps. And a lot of I think what I would say about this is that where we started from 8 years ago was taking seriously the fact that San Antonio has among the highest poverty rates in all of the US and has for a long time. And it has some of the most extreme economic segregation. So the gap between 2 of our zip codes, one northern suburb and one kind of inner city suburb or inner city neighborhood, the economic gap between those 2 zip codes is, according to a 2017 study, wider than 82 zip codes in the US. And so we decided to sort of take that gap seriously and to figure out what can we do to address that, to deal with the deep economic and cultural segregation that exists in our city. So that's what we're up to. I'll pause. I know I just said a lot. So that's the kind of the overview of our work.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And thanks for touching on, like, so many people know Laity Lodge. It kind of has a
Mhm.
reputation that spans so many different spheres. And so I think people listening go, oh yeah, I've heard of Laity Lodge, but I had no idea who started that, who pioneered that work. And what a great, we could have a whole separate conversation. I was thinking about getting time with you, and I thought, I'm deeply interested in people who have resources to steward and being, like what makes impact over generations. And, there's people who are thinking about, I have this dream to buy a ranch and do this with it, right? There's so
Yeah.
many people who have these different ideas, and some of those get off the ground, some of them don't, some of them burn out. But this is an example of something that has endured generationally and stayed focused on its aim and reached across so many different people's lives and impacted
Yeah.
in so many great ways. It's very, very cool. So we'll come back to that. But the Know Your
Yeah.
Neighbor initiative, that's the part that of the work that narrows in on a particular city. And I love that you guys are thinking about San Antonio and saying, okay, let's look at the issues facing San Antonio. So we'll be talking about San Antonio, but as everybody's listening, I think what I'm interested in is some of the lessons learned, some of the impact being discovered, some of the stories being shared. We're going to hear like, oh, that's similar in my neighborhood. And the approach maybe is a way that I can break through even just pastors who are thinking about their church community or business leaders thinking about how to have impact. So I'm super excited to kind of look at this from different directions. When you guys say the success of the initiative, like if the initiative is successful, we're 8 years into this project, how do you define that? Like, what is your hope to be how do you measure success just before we start looking at the particulars? What's the aim and the goal of the initiative?
The high level aim is to bridge our city's gaps with relationships. We want relationships to be coordinated between high wealth and low wealth parts of the city. We believe that change is not going to happen until people know each other. And so we envision a city that is, as we say, neighboring together, that is actually physically connecting in regular ways where you have name, phone numbers, interactions with people from zip codes that are not your own. It's a very bubbled city, like a lot of major Americans, but really every American major city is bubbled, is segregated in terms of economics, class, opportunity, resources, and so on. San Antonio is like that in an extreme way. And so our aim is to pierce those bubbles. And I mean, the measurement question is really big and complicated, and we're measuring everything that we do. We're trying to figure that out as we go, and we've taken that seriously from the get-go. But one thing I would say that we want to be able to count is the number of, say, institutional partnerships that have been catalyzed between different parts of town. So maybe you have a church from our wealthy north side and a church from a low wealth south side part of town. What are they doing together? Like, can we coordinate them together in a way that is not just charity work and not just project based, but actually integrating those relationships in ways that are lasting and sustainable? The same thing might be true between businesses from different parts of town, between schools from different parts of town, and so on. So how do we get our institutions to know what the people within them to know one another, talk to one another, and get serious, about neighboring together in some serious way at the institutional level, at the group level, and at the individual level? That's part of what we're tracking.
Yeah, no, that's so good. I mentioned James Davison Hunter's work and his kind of conviction and others that change, true, lasting, sustainable change happens through institutions. And if you miss
Yeah.
that, if we don't think institutionally, then we don't understand how sustainable change is going to happen. And I think I was in Macon, Georgia, and saw the exact same thing, especially in the church sphere, that you have churches in zip codes that are incredibly resourced and incredibly economically positioned to do tremendous amounts of good. And literally not even a half a mile from those churches, there are churches that are literally collapsing in on themselves that still
Right.
have vital, vibrant congregations, but the facilities, the resources that they have to steward,
Right.
the problems they're facing in the neighborhood are completely under resourced. How have you been? Is the shared table the how you are bringing people together? And if so, talk a little bit about that, because at an institutional level, I think other people in other cities have tried that, and we've maybe had bursts where we've seen success, but it hasn't been lasting. What are you seeing that's worked? And is it the shared table where you're getting people together at an institutional level, or how have you brought people together at an institutional level?
I think it's important to say that we didn't begin by saying we need to get people together. We're a convening organization. I talked about all the camps and retreats. That is what we are especially known for and good at. Laity Lodge, hosts people really, really well all year around and has been for a long time. However, when we started this work, we knew we wanted to use public storytelling to drive our mission in some way. And so we actually began with a newsroom. We ran a nonprofit newsroom doing stories and some investigative in journalism on local inequality, economic inequality, what's happening, what are the policies, and so on. And we learned pretty quickly. We had some success. We broke some news. We had some interesting news partnerships, but you could also see in our analytics that we were preaching to the choir. We were reaching people who really care about these things already, who care about economic issues and economic justice. And we were resourcing them with good information, but we weren't piercing those levels that I talked about. We weren't reaching our intended audience. We wanted to grow the conversation about these things, and we weren't. And and to make a long story short, we decided to rebuild with our audience first and foremost in mind. What do they want and need? And we surveyed them. We reached out to the people who knew the foundation and who come to our camps and retreats, read our magazine. We put out a quarterly magazine, and we asked them about how their sense of their community. And one of the things that we learned is that they do care deeply about these issues, like kind of to it kind of gives a lie to some stereotypes about high wealth Christians, that they maybe look down on these other kind of neighborhoods, and shame them and just they should pull themselves up by their bootstraps mentality. That's not what we found. We found that they actually really care about these issues, but just don't know much about them and don't know people who are living in these circumstances and want to. And so my background's in journalism, academia and journalism. And so I want to tell stories. I want to get out and beat the pavement and interview people and then write you a 4,000 word, narrative driven piece of journalism that gives you lots of information. People don't, need that or want that to my great dismay. But they do still want to know these issues. And so sometimes sometimes they don't know how much they want them until they kind of get warmed up. One of the things that happened with this program is that I was writing stories. I told you we had a newsroom, and every now and then I would have someone who was close to us, like a stakeholder, ask me, can you I've read the stories, but and I've lived in San Antonio for 25 years, but I've never been in these places that you're talking about that are, as you say, very, very close by, proximate to us. But, why would I ever go there? Except for maybe to, around Christmas time or Thanksgiving, right? To do some acts of service. So can you show me? And so I started driving people around, just taking them into neighborhoods that are close to where they are, but they had never really been inside of before, and introducing them to people. And I would just do it kind of without thinking that much about it. But 2, 3, 4 months later, I would see those people again, and repeatedly I would hear, I can't shake that day we had. That driving experience, or that one person that we got out of your car and talked to, that rattled me, and I'm still thinking about it 3, 4, 5 months later. And I began to learn, oh, that's how people learn. They don't learn through reading and watching amazing videos. We still make media, but they learn with their whole bodies.
Mm.
And so we began to sort of take that seriously. And there's a lot I could say that we've done a lot of research on this. There's a lot of good social science and scientific research about how persuasion happens and how learning happens. And really, even one of the godfathers of sociology, a man named Gordon Allport, had a theory called the contact hypothesis, where he basically showed, this is in the mid-century, last century, he showed that the way things like racial prejudice decline is through in-group association. When two groups of people who hate each other come together and have some contact, even just a little bit of contact, their the degree of their prejudice begins to decline. And so we have kind of uh, built our program with convening. We're a storytelling program, but the most important stories we tell are the ones we tell in person, and we do it in a variety of ways. We have we have a shared table program where we get people to break bread across different zip codes, and we coordinate those tables. Sometimes we'll have kind of hand-picked people that we know from different parts of town who might have a shared interest. They might all be doctors or they might all be educators. Um, and we'll get them together to talk about their lives. And they live worlds apart, 4 miles apart, maybe, but like worlds apart in terms of what they're experiencing every day. We will do shared table programs that are more topical. Like we have an affordable housing kind of series happening right now. We've made a documentary about affordability challenges in San Antonio. So we're having people watch that and then come together and have a meal together and talk about it in deep ways. And we try to again, we might have 40 or 50 people come, but we know what zip codes they're coming from. And so we're careful about who sits at what table so that you're confronted with a story that's very different from your own. So shared tables are a big part of what we do. We do a lot of neighborhood-based learning, immersion experiences, half-day experience in a neighborhood that's on the other side of town from you, and walk some streets and talk to some locals and eat some food from that area and do some learning about the history of that area and how it became the way that it is. From storytellers of people, not me, people who live there, people whose story really embodies these issues. We have learning cohorts. That's probably one of the most powerful things that we do. 10 to 15 people commit to a 15-month journey together to do some really deep learning about these issues. They cover kind of one part of town at a time or one history of San Antonio at a time. They do it in those places where things happen across town. They commit to about 2 days a quarter of deep in-person learning. So yeah, we bring people together, in all kinds of different ways. We have community speaker series, and like I said, we still make media, documentaries, videos. We're working on, a lot of, I think, interesting media work and learning resources. But we have learned that if storytelling is not coordinated with in-person contacts, it doesn't matter much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting to kind of have data and research that supports that. And intuitively, we know in our own story that that's how we've
Yeah,
changed. If we go back and recount, like, how did I really change? It was through
correct.
this contact. And yet we don't see that on the program level. And so I love that's you guys are being thoughtful and intentional about saying that's the thing that makes the difference. And I love that you said that you are challenging the stereotype, because that's what I'm interested in and have found is that we assume the worst sometimes. And that's true here in Tampa. We have a zip code that a lot of the wealth is consolidated in this zip code, and there's an assumption that people in that zip code don't care about anything. We
Yeah.
have a street called Kennedy, and nobody cares about anything north of Kennedy if you're from south of Kennedy. But if you meet anybody from south of Kennedy, they actually don't think like that. They're actually some of the most radically generous people and engaged, but there's a gap in it. Just somebody has to convene or facilitate that. And once that starts happening, it seems like beautiful things kind of organically start to take root. And has that been have you seen things kind of generate and germinate from just the convening that's being done? Or are you actually building out like a kind of a next steps process as you convene these groups and you make these introductions and people get exposure? Do you provide resource that kind of builds a ladder for people to engage at a next step? Or do you make suggestions? Or are you truly just saying, hey, let's trust people to actually be who we were made to be? And once that contact has been made and those barriers have come down, we don't know what's going to happen, and we don't want to be directive, so we'll stay out of that. Have you found kind of a sweet spot between those two?
Both. We do both all the time. We definitely hope that this work is catalytic people will gather momentum and start to do things on their own. But we knew from the get-go when we first started doing this, that we were going to have to manufacture a lot of, and I say that word, it sounds cold, but what I mean is, like, we have to be the arranger over and over and over again at first. We often say that we're trying to build the cultural conditions for structural change. We care about the structures of San Antonio, the economic flow within San Antonio, the possibilities around education and healthcare and housing that exist, throughout our city. But we're not starting at the policy level, we're starting at the cultural level. And I talked early on when we first, I told you we had a newsroom, we were starting to pivot to this other strategy, and we didn't really know what we were going to do exactly. And it took some time to kind of research the field of what's called narrative change. How do narratives shift? Narratives around, abolitionism, from that to child labor laws to environmentalism to whatever. How do perspectives shift over time? How's that happened? And so I kind of dove deep into that, and I talked to a man named John Powell, who was a professor at UC Berkeley, who has done a lot of work in this space. And I asked him to give me an hour on the phone and just interviewed him about this and told him what we wanted to do in San Antonio. And I told him, like, what we're really concerned about is, like, the massive gaps, between our neighborhoods, and the fact that these groups don't interact with one another, high class and people from low wealth backgrounds. And I said, he kept saying, you have to, bridge building, it was the word he kept using. You're gonna have to build bridges, do some bridge building work. And I said, can you be a little more explicit? Like, what do you mean? But how do I know those bridges? How do I know what I'm doing has resulted in those bridges? And he said, because you will have built them. You have to be the bridge builder. You have to create he said, don't get it twisted. You're not going to, like, inspire people to totally change who they interact with in the short term. Like, you're not going to inspire your way into that happening in your city. You're going to have to build the bridge and then build it again and then build it again. Create events and then more events and then more events. You have to invite people into this over and over and over again. You're a community organizer trying to reorganize, reorient people. And that was so, like, I was like, my Lord, this is going to be hard and take forever. And it was overwhelming, but it was the right wisdom and counsel that we needed to hear. And it kind of helped us sober up and realize, okay, we're not running a messaging campaign around knowing your neighbor. We are not just going to be able to provide information about how and why San Antonio is segregated. That's not going to make people care. The local history of redlining is not going to inspire anyone to change, the way that they're behaving in San Antonio. What will, though, is if their relationships change, is if who they're texting changes, right? If they know names and faces that have phone numbers from people in different zip codes, then that's actually going to shift. If someone can call on them, make claims on them because they have a relationship, then we might see something. And so all that array of convening types I told you before, shared tables, cohorts, community speakers, luncheons, neighborhood-based workshops, that's stuff that has accumulated over time, programmatic activities that have accumulated over time, because we realized we have to convene over and over and over again. So having said that, yes, we do, also see people taking this up on their own, for sure. We see people getting into relationship with one another, and I can give you examples of that. And that's very exciting to see. But we clear with ourselves, with our team, with our stakeholders, that for this to work, we have to be committed to being the bridge builders, to actually building the bridge people will walk across over and over and over again.
Yeah. That's so helpful to even just hear you say, like, no, challenge that assumption that if we just do this once, if we just change, we convene once or twice, that there'll create a flow.
Yeah.
That actually we have to be the catalyst for change is going to come over time. As we build that bridge, then people will come and cross that bridge. but somebody's got to build it. And to assume that if we talk about it, they will build it. That's a great assumption to challenge for me, particularly, because I want to believe like, oh, we can point and call people and,
Right.
but not actually have to convene those spaces. But I hear you saying that no, that's the work, is to actually bring the people together. And there was I can't remember which video it was in, but a speaker in one of the videos that you guys curated talked about widening the circle of concern. And that's what I hear you describing is
Yeah.
I know my neighbors, the ones whose houses touch my house and the ones that my house faces, but there's this call to widen the circle of concern. And as I listened to that, I kept thinking it doesn't happen at a policy level. It doesn't happen at a prosy level. It is this, if you think about C.S. Lewis, imagination precedes reason. Like the way that I imagine my city, if I don't even have an imagination for people on the other side, or if I have a wrong imagination or a false imagination, then that's where reality is going to follow that imagination. And I'm curious for you, as you've watched people go through these experiences and participate in these convening moments, have you seen that it's easier than you may have assumed, or that we're told? Because right now the narrative it is we're a divided nation in a divided moment, and it's getting worse.
Yeah.
And so we're making movies
Yeah.
like Civil War, and everybody's saying it's inevitable. Eventually, it's going to snap, it's going to boil, and we're further than we've ever been. That's the narrative. Underneath that, I go, I don't know that that's true, because the people I meet in the grocery store, everybody wants to help each other out. It seems to be not as divided in the moments as the story is. Are you finding that when people come together, that circle of concern widens pretty beautifully and naturally, that's where the movement wants to go in that direction? Or do you feel like, no, what we encounter is a ton of entrenched fear and division, and you guys scratch your head and go, oh man, this is going to be the same group convening 30 times before we even move an inch? Is it like that? Or do you go, wow, when people get around a table, it's amazing to watch how quickly that circle of concern starts to widen?
Yeah. I mean, we have the same concerns about polarization and fierce judgment. There's a lot of money to be made in polarization, which I think is why um, it's so successful and we hear so much about it. But like I said, that first survey we sent out to our constituency asking them how they see their community, what we heard was a deep desire to know and be known, to reach across their own experience. Yes, they're concerned about their own selfish interests. We all are and have to be. But we also heard a lot of concern about what was happening in the parts of their town that they don't feel like they have access to and just didn't know how to get access. And so instead of fear, we heard curiosity and even longing um, to to become more aware, more informed, and but mostly to be in relationship with people from a different part of town. And I think a lot about how uh, a lot of the reason that people are so divided is that they're just living in cities that were designed that way, right? Like it's just we live in bubbles because the bubbles were created for us to live in. And the some of the original design and development trends in a place like San Antonio, driven by, racialized deed restrictions and mortgage and lending processes that were defined in terms of race legally for a long time, and then urban renewal, which threw up interstates in ways that further cemented divides between communities, and in fact, in some cases, just cut off communities from one another. And then you live inside those neighborhoods, and they've been created this way, and the where you shop and where you go to school, and which parks you have access to, and what kind of medical facilities you have access to are all determined by those prehistories. And so how could it be otherwise, right? And so the only way to deal with that is by, getting people reasons to get up and out of those communities to come into new kinds of shared spaces. And we find that when they do that, I mean, the number of times we've had a negative, really negative feedback, or a response that you might call fearful or judgmental, or pretty small. We create these spaces to be safe. We create them very, very thoughtfully. We create them in ways that we're really careful about the kind of dominant voices in the room. In fact, not letting there be two dominant voices in the room, or voices that are too dominant in the room. We put a lot of thought and care and planning into what's going to happen, so that there can be real conversation, thoughtful questions, reflection. People are craving that. They just are. We did another survey this year that showed, one of the findings from it was just how much people are simply craving reflection, just a space to think, to reflect, to use their own voice, to wrestle with complex questions. We love it as humans, right? It's hard to find that space in our world, but when that space is provided, people respond really, really well. And, we're all carrying biases and prejudices. We all have them. And, but I think few of us are satisfied with that and want to work on that and want to be helped in working on that. So, I think a lot about this cohort that we ran. I mentioned these learning cohorts. One of them was all faith leaders, pastors across San Antonio. We had, I think, 10 different pastors from, no, 11 different pastors from 10 different zip codes. And they were in very different places theologically, ethnically, politically, way they ran their ministry. And one of the relationships that came out of that cohort experience was with a pastor who was running a Anglican church in a white, wealthy part of town. I think his church was 100% white and quite wealthy. And he got to be friends with another pastor in that cohort who was a Latina running a church in a part of town that is like the poorest of the poor in San Antonio. Prostitutes and kids who are being used as drug mules on her church's steps on the regular. So they could not be more different. And normally what happens is that the wealthy church will do a project or two with like the low income church, right? And they got to know each other, and he asked her, how can we help?
Mm.
And she said, well, one thing you can do is like not do any projects for our church, because I'm so sick of people like you coming in and like doing one thing with us and then going away and actually not doing a very good job. Like she actually ended up giving us all a tour of her church, and we saw like half renovated kitchen from a short-term mission group that had come in, and like bathrooms where the drywall had been torn out. They planned to renovate it and then ran out of resources or ran out of time that week and just never finished it, and left her worse off than she was before. And so she's like, I don't need any more of this kind of thing from ministries like yours. But what we do need is relationship. So can we just get to know each other? And so that's kind of what they've done in the last couple of years since, is just keep focusing on relationship. They just got to know each other as pastors first, a lot of meals, coffees, cooking together, whatever. And then we helped them pull together a year's worth of shared tables between two different groups in their congregation. I think, I don't know, 8 or 10 people on each side, had a series of 4 or 5 shared tables over the course of a year, didn't make any commitments about anything they were going to do together, just worked on building relationship.
Mm.
And now they're talking about, a sustainable kind of commitment where they're doing work together across our city's divide. They, like I said, they could not have lived in more different worlds, probably had the kinds of prejudices about each other that you described with Kennedy. Like it was that kind of that contrast. But now they know each other. They can't think that way about people who live in the northern wealthy neighborhood or people who live on the near west side. They know better now because they know each other.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. Even just going back to that north of Kennedy, every city has that. And I think you described
Mhm.
that like just the planning of our cities. Winston Churchill, first we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. First we shape our cities and
Yeah.
thereafter they shape us. And so just even knowing that and going, of course, right? Like this was designed, and not even assigning like an ill motive to that, but we got caught up in building things pragmatically and efficiently. And well, this makes sense, right? Not from a human flourishing standpoint. And then sometimes with ill intent. And so now
Yeah.
we're all inhabiting cities that are shaping us. Just knowing that and saying, let's ask a good question and say, are the structures that we're immersed in, that we're traveling every day, how are those shaping us? That's a great place to start. I think I want to hear you on this because you all and your team have learned so much. If you could say, like the pastors you described, the parents what's the essential thing for us if we really do want to say, hey, I want to be a part of knowing my neighbor? What would you say if you were to coach people and just say, if you really want to be serious about that, then then take this seriously. Is it that you have to be willing to open yourself up to a different perspective and be willing to listen? Is it the skill of listening? Is it a posture of humility? Like, what's the thing that you would say if you're going to take knowing your neighbor seriously and you're going to show up to a convening table and you're going to be a participant in a beautiful way? What needs to be true of us?
Well, the first thing I would say is you have to move your body. Like you have to be in new spaces that may not be comfortable for you and become a pilgrim within your own city. Go places and just like go buy food or visit a park in a part of town that is not your own, that you might know in your heart you kind of look down on or are skeptical of or hold stereotypes about. Just go and be in that space, and buy a slice of pizza or a sandwich or whatever and talk to the person behind the counter for a minute. That's where I started in this work, and I think that can be a very powerful learning tool. It'll pique your curiosity. It'll help you see how much you don't know, and then you'll know what you need to learn next.
Mm.
So that's the first thing. And then I would say, to answer your question more directly, if you are invited into a space like this, um, I think and you're preparing to go into it, I think you have to be ready to do two things, actually. And I think one is what you said, listen. Definitely go to listen. But you also have to be ready to speak, to share your story. We have found in our analytics in this work, we survey everything we do. We get a lot of feedback from people. And one of the things that we found, and then I have since found social science that backs this up, is that people learn more when they have a chance to contribute. When they have a chance to talk, and share their perspective, they actually learn more about the other person's perspective.
Mm.
So we actually don't want people just to be listening sponges. We want them to have to summon up something from within themselves as well and share. So a lot of our work is driven by questions.
Mm.
Good question asking, good productive, reflective questions that help people to overcome their own nervousness and come out of themselves. And recently we had a shared table where I think I mentioned this before about the housing affordability issues in our town, and everyone had to begin the night at their table they were at by talking about their own home story, like what is home to you, and talk about your home journey. And so you would have someone talking about how, yeah, I lived in the same home for the last 28 years, and I've raised all my kids there, and it's been a beautiful place, and we have cherished every minute in that house. And this person tells their story, and then the person across from them says, I've lived in 17 different houses in the last 7 years because I keep getting evicted and I'm always on the go. And like, it is hard to like have told your story of relative comfort and then hear a story of harm and trauma. And for both people, that is very, very difficult. But they did it. And there was multiple stories that night of things like that happening at different tables where someone had to, the person who was affluent has to also be brave to admit their affluence in that moment, knowing that the other person across the table has had a very different experience. And then the person who has been kicked around a lot has to be brave to share and speak from that trauma with people who have had so much comfort. It's hard to do.
Mm.
Um, but it's what we know, again, from both our own research and learning in our program, and also what the sort of scientific research says, is that if they do that, if they both listen and share their perspective, the needle inside them moves way more than if they're just listening.
Mm.
So again, my counsel would be, if you're going to a space like that, be prepared to listen, but also be prepared to share.
Yeah, that's so good. How do you think you have, I guess not changed is not the right way to say it, but grown? Your circle of concern is widened. How have you been shaped as somebody who moved to San Antonio, saying I'm never going to, I would never have predicted that I'd live in San Antonio. And now I'm here and I've participated in convening these tables and I've seen a lot of impact, seen a lot of stories, but you're a very, very wise person and compassionate person, reflective person anyway. And but how has this particular experience, when you go for a walk at night and you go, you know what? Wow, I would have never guessed that this had impacted me in this way.
Man, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of places I could go with that. I mean, I grew up rough, and part of what got me into this work is that, I know what it's like to not be sure where food is going to come from, and to switch schools all the time because your family's constantly moving because of instability. And so I part of what this work has done is to help me come to terms with my own story. um, I look like someone who's had privilege his whole life, and I have, by virtue of being a white man. But economically, that was not my story. And so, yeah, this work has helped me go back and wrestle through my own upbringing and what happened. And yeah, I've just done a lot of personal work. I think that one of the main ways that I've shifted in recent years is that I I just think differently about social change and about influencing than I used to.
Mm.
I think about it way more locally. I don't really care that much about what's happening outside of San Antonio these days. I'm a news junkie.
Mm.
I care a lot about basketball. I do pay attention to a lot of NBA, but in terms of national politics, I mean, I keep up and I have concern, and of course, but my focus is on San Antonio, and it's on the place where I live, and I think that will always be the case. If I have to move for some reason, and my family lives somewhere else someday, I'm gonna make that my focus. As a former and recovering news junkie, I've realized I can't do much about what's happening nationally. And so I don't want to spend 80% of my time reading about it and thinking about it. I want to
Mm.
spend a very small amount of my time actually reading and thinking about those things.
Mm.
So that's been a big shift for me personally, because I used to spend an enormous amount of time reading about national issues and national politics. And I just don't anymore. Um, and and then also, I think the other thing I would say is that, my sense of, I think I've just grown more patient. Like, the issues that we're dealing with are urgent because people's lives are hurting now. But the big structural changes that need to happen are going to take forever. They're just going to take not forever, but they're going to take a long time, and they're going to be incremental. And I've gotten to the place where I'm okay with like the slow and incremental change. I think it's really, really important. And every good history of big social change movements like abolition, like the civil rights movement, were long and slow. And they started with a lot of small, incremental, very local, very strategic work. And so I've tried to become a student of that and realize that's what it's going to take here in San Antonio too.
Yeah. And it's so good. I know that we're out of time, so I've got to respect the clock. But I could go on forever. I remember my mind is going back to sitting by a fire at the Oregon coast. Beautiful little the Headlands Lodge out there is such a gorgeous place, and that's where you told me at the time, Zach, people are really digesting 2,500 words or less. And I remember like my heart sank in that moment because I was writing a book and I was like, then what am I doing? Right. And
Right.
I think it's so wonderful to hear with that in my memory of like, no, change is long, slow, deep. And there is an
Yeah.
embodied way that we learn and that we change and that it's ongoing. It's guys like you and I are still in that process, and we
Yeah.
get to participate at our table and in our neighborhood and in our church and where we are, and that we can kind of let go of some of that pressure to make those giant changes happen more quickly, and at the same time take really seriously that really impactful things happen when we widen our circle of concern and when we do start to say, I want to know my neighbor, and so I'm going to move my body and I'm going to listen, and I'm not going to be afraid to tell my story and tell it honestly because people are going to make assumptions about me. So everything you just shared in the last almost an hour has just been a treasure to me personally, but to everybody listening. I just want to say thank you to your team and to the foundation. The fact that you all exist and are thinking about San Antonio, I think is something good that we're going to take away from this of how we can think about our cities. So thank you for the work you're doing and the example of embodying those convening spaces. It's such a gift for me. Even I was taking notes about what we can do here in Tampa, and just for as a
Mhm.
person, I'm grateful. I love the Elton John song. I thank the Lord there are people out there like you, right? And I think that's true. Like it's
Thank you.
inspiring to think that you're out in San Antonio. So Patton, thanks for giving up some time. Really, really grateful for it, and keep up the good work.
Appreciate that, Zach. Thanks for all those kind words. And I'm really glad to know that you exist as well and are out there on the East Coast doing good work in Tampa. So, yeah, but thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, grateful. All right, take care.